On their wedding night, he looked at her across the candlelit bedroom, not with desire, not with warmth, but with the flat, unblinking calm of a man delivering a verdict to a condemned prisoner. Cassian Volkov, the most feared crime lord in the city, spoke exactly 7 words that would define the next 2 years of Vivian Ashcroft's life. Never touch me, and never ask why. She had married danger. She had prepared for violence. She had steeled herself for a cold man in a cold world. But nothing had prepared her for the particular cruelty of being completely invisible to the one person who was supposed to see her. If you've ever loved someone who refused to let you in, stay until the very end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Bye. The wedding had cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Vivian knew this because she had seen the invoice. Not intentionally, not by snooping, but because it had been left on the kitchen counter of her father's brownstone 3 days before the ceremony, weighted down by a crystal paperweight shaped like a fist. $240,000. Flowers flown in from the Netherlands. A string quartet imported from Vienna. A 5-tier cake assembled by a pastry team that had catered for heads of state. Every detail immaculate. Every detail chosen by someone other than the bride. She had not been consulted on a single thing, not the dress, which was exquisite and which she hated precisely because of how well it fit a version of herself she had never agreed to become. Not the venue, a privately owned estate on the eastern edge of the city whose marble floors reflected light so cleanly that Vivian had spent the entire ceremony watching her own distorted reflection beneath her feet instead of the man standing at the altar. Not the guest list, which ran to 300 names and included maybe 40 people Vivian had ever met, the rest being associates, subordinates, and carefully positioned allies of the groom. Not even the vows. Those had been written by a lawyer. Her father, Senator Edmund Ashcroft, had walked her down the aisle with the practiced composure of a man who had made one catastrophic mistake and was now executing the most elegant possible damage control. His political career had collapsed 14 months earlier, not in a single dramatic fall, but in the way a building condemned by structural failure collapses, slowly at first, one crack at a time, and then all at once. Campaign finance irregularities, a federal subpoena, donors vanishing like smoke. Edmund Ashcroft had spent 30 years building a name, and it had taken 11 days of news coverage to reduce it to a punchline. Cassian Volkov had made the problem disappear. Vivian had never been given a precise accounting of what that had cost her father, what favors were owed, what agreements were signed, what she herself represented in the transaction. She was not naive enough to believe it was simple charity. Men like Cassian Volkov did not write checks for strangers out of goodwill. She had walked into this marriage with her eyes open to the shape of the arrangement, even if the fine print remained deliberately obscured. What she had not anticipated was how completely she would disappear inside it. The ceremony lasted 40 minutes. The reception lasted 5 hours. Vivian smiled until her face ached, accepted congratulations from people whose names she immediately forgot, drank 2 glasses of champagne that tasted like nothing, and watched her new husband move through the crowded ballroom with the ease of a man who had never once in his adult life been uncertain of his place in any room. Cassian Volkov was 41 years old. He was broad across the shoulders, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut rather than grown. He moved without excess, spoke without waste, and when he looked at someone, really looked. The quality of that attention was so absolute it was almost violent. He looked at Vivian exactly twice during the entire reception. Once when they cut the cake, because the photographer required it. Once when she laughed, genuinely, accidentally, at something his elderly accountant said, and for a fraction of a second, something shifted in Cassian's expression. Not warmth exactly, more like the recognition of something unexpected, the way a man might look at a painting he had passed 100 times and suddenly noticed properly for the first time. Then the moment was gone, and he turned back to his conversation, and Vivian understood that she had already begun disappearing. The car that took them from the reception to his estate, their estate, she was supposed to think of it that way now, moved through the city in silence so complete it had texture. The partition between them and the driver was raised. The leather seat smelled of cedar and something metallic she couldn't identify. Cassian spent the 40-minute drive reading documents from a leather folio, his reading glasses low on his nose, a pen moving occasionally across a page. He did not speak. He did not look up. His body occupied its half of the back seat with total self-sufficiency, as though Vivian were simply a feature of the vehicle rather than a person sitting 18 inches away. She looked out the window and watched the city lights blur past and told herself this was fine. This was the arrangement. She had known what she was stepping into. She had been wrong about what it would feel like from inside. The estate was enormous and immaculate and deeply, profoundly quiet. A housekeeper named Mrs. Caldwell met them at the door. A compact woman in her 60s with the expression of someone who had seen everything and catalogued none of it, and showed Vivian to her rooms while Cassian disappeared down a corridor without a word. Vivian's rooms were a full suite on the second floor. Bedroom, sitting room, bathroom tiled in pale marble. A small private terrace overlooking a garden that was beautiful in the way of things that are tended without being loved. The closet was already stocked with clothes in her size. The bathroom counter held toiletries she had not selected. The bookshelf held novels she had not chosen, though someone had evidently guessed at her taste with reasonable accuracy. Everything provided. Everything anticipated. Nothing asked. Mrs. Caldwell said, "Mr. Volkov asked that you make yourself comfortable. If there is anything you require, the household staff is available at any hour." Vivian said, "Where does he sleep?" A pause, slight but audible. "Mr. Volkov's rooms are on the third floor. He maintains a separate suite." "Of course he does," Vivian said, and heard the flatness in her own voice and didn't bother correcting it. She was alone by 10 o'clock on her wedding night. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dress that cost more than a year of her former salary and looked at the ceiling and breathed very carefully and did not cry, because crying would mean this had broken something, and she refused to let the first night define the whole shape of what was coming. She would adapt. She was her father's daughter in at least that one way. Edmund Ashcroft had survived worse than loneliness by simply refusing to acknowledge its weight. It was nearly midnight when she heard the footsteps in the hallway. Unhurried, deliberate. Then a knock. Not gentle, not aggressive, simply present. "Come in," she said, because there was nothing else to say. Cassian Volkov entered her room still dressed in his wedding suit, jacket gone, collar open by one button. He carried himself the way he always seemed to, as though gravity were a negotiation he had already won. He stopped several feet from the bed. He looked at her with that same quality of total, unsparing attention she had noticed at the reception, and she sat straighter without meaning to, an instinctive response to being genuinely seen for the first time all evening. He said, "I want to establish some things clearly." "All right," she said, "this arrangement is a legal marriage. You will have access to accounts, staff, transportation, and this estate. You will attend certain public events as my wife. You will not speak to journalists. You will not contact my associates without my prior knowledge. You will not involve yourself in business that is not yours to involve yourself in." "That sounds like a list of things I will not do," Vivian said. "Is there anything on the other side of the ledger?" Something crossed his face. Not irritation, but perhaps the awareness of it. "Safety," he said. "I will keep you safe." She held his gaze. "From what?" "From everything I cannot predict. From people who will try to use you to reach me. From consequences you didn't earn and shouldn't have to pay." He said it without melodrama, the way someone describes weather. Matter of fact. Inevitable. "There are people who would put a gun to your head to make me do something. If I let you get close to me, if anyone believes you matter to me in any way that goes beyond paperwork, you become a target." "So the distance is protection," she said. "Yes, and I'm simply supposed to accept that." "You married me," he said, and there was no cruelty in it, which somehow made it worse. It was simply a fact. "I am telling you how this works so you understand rather than spend the next years confused about what you're living inside." He moved to leave, then stopped with one hand on the doorframe. He did not turn back. "Never touch me," he said quietly. "And never ask about my business. Stay alive and you will have everything money can buy." Then he was gone. Vivian sat in the enormous bed, in the enormous room, in the enormous estate, and understood for the first time the specific quality of the loneliness she had signed herself into. It was not the loneliness of being without company. It was the loneliness of being in proximity to someone who had deliberately constructed a wall between you and every part of themselves that might constitute a connection. and then told you the wall was for your own good. She was 28 years old. She had given up a career, an apartment, a life assembled piece by piece from her own choices, and she had walked into this because her father needed rescuing, and she had loved him enough to pay whatever price was asked. She understood the exchange. She did not regret it exactly. But as she lay back in the dark and listened to the absolute silence of the enormous house, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not grief, but a slow spreading numbness, as though the emotional temperature of the estate were already transferring to her, as though proximity to a man this sealed off from warmth would eventually seal her off too, by simple conduction. She fell asleep with the light still on. It seemed wrong to choose darkness deliberately. 2 years passed in exactly the way Cassian had described them. Not badly, in the measurable sense. The house ran smoothly. The accounts were generous. When Vivian expressed interest in continuing her work as an architectural consultant, she had spent 3 years at a firm downtown before all this. Cassian had arranged a private studio in the East Wing, stocked with drafting tables and software and a dedicated assistant who appeared at 9 each morning and disappeared at 5. She worked. She maintained a version of professional life. She attended charity galas and opening nights and foundation dinners as Cassian's wife, dressed impeccably, smiled gracefully, answered questions about her husband with the diplomatic vagueness she had learned to deploy like a tool. They shared a dinner table perhaps twice a week, when schedules aligned, and on those evenings Cassian was not unkind. He was not warm, but he asked about her work with what seemed like genuine if contained interest. He remembered things she mentioned, that she preferred the fish to the lamb, that she found the dining room's acoustics irritating, that she had an inexplicable aversion to the color yellow, and small adjustments appeared without comment. The menu changed. The dining room was repainted. He accommodated without connecting. It was an exquisitely careful arrangement. He never touched her. Not a hand on her arm, not a brush of fingers passing the bread, not even the automatic physical proximity of two people inhabiting shared domestic space. He maintained a precise, consistent distance, as though calculated. She began to suspect it was. She had stopped trying to close that distance somewhere in the middle of the first year. The initial attempts had been modest, a hand on the table within reach, holding a conversation slightly longer than required, asking questions that weren't about logistics. He had responded each time with the gentle, immovable redirection of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and had decided to keep doing it. She was not a stupid woman. She read the signal clearly, and she stopped sending the opposite one, because there was a particular humiliation in reaching and being not rejected, but simply not received. She built her own life inside the walls of his. She made the studios her territory. She developed friendships, carefully bounded ones, because her circumstances invited a particular kind of social wariness, but real ones. A woman named Dana, who ran a gallery nearby and had no interest in Cassian's world, and made Vivian laugh with a frequency that felt like medicine. A neighbor called Estelle, in her 70s, who had outlived 2 husbands and approached Vivian's unusual domestic situation with brisk, non-judgmental curiosity. She learned the rhythms of the estate, which staff members were talkative and which were not, which of Cassian's rare appearances in a shared room meant he was distracted, and which meant he was, she had no other word for it, present in a way that changed the atmosphere of any space he occupied. She had become, without quite meaning to, an expert reader of a man who refused to be read. And she was lonely. She was deeply, persistently, quietly lonely in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of company and everything to do with the specific shape of what was there but inaccessible. It was a Tuesday in early October when everything began to shift. She had gone to the market herself, a choice she made occasionally when the particular silence of the estate became something she needed to physically exit. She took a car and one of Cassian's security staff, a quiet young man named Torres, who had the discretion to give her 20 feet of space while remaining visible. The market was 3 blocks from the estate, an open-air setup that smelled of bread and wet stone and autumn leaves turning in the gutters. She was trying to manage a reusable bag that had split at one seam and a paper sack balanced against her hip when a voice said, "Here, let me." It was a young man, mid-20s maybe. Flour dusted on the cuffs of his jacket, dark-haired, open-faced, with the kind of smile that didn't carry any agenda she could detect. He took the paper sack with both hands before she could decline and did it with such natural ease that it didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like what it was, so someone noticing a woman struggling and simply helping. "I work at the bakery 2 stalls over," he said. "I'm Owen. The bread's mine, actually, if you bought the sourdough." "I did," she said, surprised into honesty. "It's very good." "It's better yesterday," he said. "I overproofed this morning's batch. I'm still working out the timing on this oven." She laughed. It came out of her before she could moderate it. A real laugh. Unmanaged. The kind that surprised her own body. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed that way. Without planning it. Without checking herself first. They walked to her car together. He carried the bag and talked about the oven, with the cheerful, self-deprecating candor of someone who had not yet learned to perform competence instead of admitting to its absence. And Vivian found herself asking questions and meaning them, and feeling, for 7 or 8 minutes on a Tuesday morning, like a woman who existed in the world instead of in a gilded capsule adjacent to it. Owen handed her the bag at the car door. Torres materialized from somewhere, took it with a look that catalogued Owen without expression. Owen, to his credit, barely flinched. He just said, "Enjoy the bread," and smiled and walked back toward his stall. Vivian watched him go and felt the return of the silence like a physical thing settling back over her shoulders. She did not know that Torres had taken a photograph. She did not know that by midnight the photograph had reached Cassian Volkov, who was sitting in his third-floor office reviewing it with the particular quality of stillness that, in another man, might have been called jealousy, but which Cassian experienced as something colder and more precise. The recognition that in a single 8-minute conversation at an open-air market, a stranger with flour on his cuffs had made his wife laugh in a way Cassian had never once managed in 2 years of marriage. He set the photograph on his desk. He looked at it for a long time. Then he made a phone call, and in a voice completely devoid of heat, he said, "Find out everything about Owen Mercer." The file on Owen Mercer was thin, which was itself the most important thing about it. Cassian read it at 2 in the morning, sitting behind his desk with a glass of water he hadn't touched, and the city's lights making pale geometry on the wall behind him. 26 years old, culinary school dropout. Not for failure, but for money, according to the school's administrative records, which Cassian's people had accessed without difficulty. A mother in Trenton with a bad hip and medical debt that had been quietly climbing for 3 years. A younger sister finishing her 2nd year of college on a partial scholarship. Owen Mercer sent money home every month, worked double shifts at the bakery on weekends, and had been shortlisted 6 months ago for a sous chef position at a restaurant downtown that he hadn't gotten because the owner had hired his brother-in-law instead. No criminal record, no affiliations, no angles. Just a young man with flour on his cuffs who had helped a woman with a broken grocery bag and made her laugh for 8 minutes on a Tuesday morning. Cassian closed the file. He sat with it for a long time, long enough for the city outside to go genuinely quiet. Long enough for the ice in an abandoned drink somewhere down the hall to finish melting without sound. He was not a man who examined his own interior landscape with any regularity. The interior landscape was something he had learned to treat like hostile terrain, to be navigated quickly and not lingered in. But sitting in the dark with a thin file about an unremarkable young baker, he found himself doing something uncomfortable. He found himself making a comparison, and the comparison was not flattering. Owen Mercer had done in 8 minutes what Cassian had failed to do in 2 years. He pulled a legal pad from his drawer, wrote a name and a number, and slid it across the desk to the edge where his assistant would find it in the morning. Then he went to bed, and he slept without difficulty, which was either a measure of his discipline or his damage, and he had stopped being able to tell the difference a long time ago. It took 9 days. 9 days for the wheels Cassian had set in motion to complete their quiet revolution. A phone call to a restaurant group in Seattle whose principal owed Cassian a favor, large enough that it had never been formally named. A position created, not manufactured from nothing, but accelerated, pulled forward, a real opportunity with a real salary and a signing bonus that would cover Owen's mother's medical debt twice over and leave enough to fund his sister's remaining tuition without strain. The offer arrived at the bakery by courier on a Monday, written on paper that cost more per sheet than Owen Mercer earned in an afternoon, and it was real in every detail that mattered. A dream, constructed with surgical precision and deployed like a weapon. Torres confirmed the handoff. The following Thursday, Owen Mercer gave notice at the bakery. The Thursday after that, he was on a plane. Vivian did not know any of this. She returned to the market the following Tuesday and found a different person behind the bakery stall. An older woman with no interest in conversation who sold her bread that was perfectly adequate and nothing more. Vivian bought it and went home and told herself that the particular flatness she felt was disproportionate, that she was not the kind of woman who attached significance to a single pleasant exchange with a stranger, that she had more composure than this. She returned the Tuesday after that, and the Tuesday after that. Owen Mercer was not there. She asked the older woman casually with the careful tone of someone who does not want to betray that the answer matters. The woman said the previous baker had taken a position out of state. "A wonderful opportunity," she said. He'd been very excited. Vivian stood in the October cold with a sourdough loaf warm against her forearm and felt something she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't grief. It was smaller and more specific than grief. It was the recognition that something brief and ordinary and genuinely good had been in her vicinity, and now it wasn't, and the shape of its absence was the exact outline of everything that had been missing from her life for 2 years. She did not ask more questions. She thanked the woman and walked back to the car and sat behind the tinted glass and breathed through her nose and counted to 10 the way she had learned to count when she was a child. And her father's house was loud with argument, and the walls felt like they were pressing in. She was still counting when a thought arrived that she did not invite. Cassian knew. She did not have evidence. She had something older than evidence, the pattern recognition of a woman who had spent 2 years learning to read a man who revealed nothing deliberately and everything inadvertently. She thought about Torres. She thought about the photograph she had not known was being taken. She thought about the precise, quiet efficiency with which inconvenient things in Cassian Volkov's world had a way of being relocated rather than confronted. She thought about a dream job in Seattle for a 26-year-old baker she had met once. She went home. She set the bread on the kitchen counter. She walked past the dining room, past the East Wing studio with its drafting tables and organized pencils, past the portrait of some previous occupant of this estate that she had never bothered to learn the name of, up the stairs, down the corridor, and she knocked on the door of Cassian's study with 3 knocks that were louder than she intended. A pause. Then, "Come in." He was behind his desk, jacket on, a call on hold by the look of the phone on his blotter. He looked up at her with the focused, assessment-grade attention he gave everything, and whatever he read in her face made him set down his pen. "Give me a minute," he said into the phone, and set it down without waiting for a response. Vivian closed the door behind her. She did not sit. The chairs in front of his desk were positioned for people seeking his attention, and she was not in a position to be seeking anything right now. She stood in the middle of the room with her coat still on and said, "What did you do?" Cassian's expression did not change. "You'll need to be more specific." "Owen Mercer." One beat of silence. Not guilty silence, calculating silence, which was somehow worse. "The baker," he said. "You had him moved. He was offered a position." "Don't." The word came out flat and sharp, and she felt it in her sternum, the effort of keeping her voice level. "Don't do that. Don't explain what you did using the cleanest possible version of it. You had him researched, you identified something he wanted, and you used it to remove him from my proximity. That is what happened." Cassian leaned back in his chair by a degree. He looked at her with something she couldn't read, not shame, not defiance, something that occupied the difficult space between them. "He was a stranger," he said. "You spoke to him once." "I know how many times I spoke to him." "Then you understand why it's not—" "I smiled," she said, and her voice cracked on the word, a single fracture she could not prevent. "I laughed at something he said, and I meant it. That is what you saw. That is what you decided required intervention. A woman laughing at a market." She pressed one hand flat against her sternum, not a dramatic gesture, but a functional one, checking that she was still breathing correctly. 2 years, Cassian. 2 years in this house, and I have been grateful. I have been appropriate. I have been exactly the version of a wife this arrangement required. I have not complained. I have not pushed. I have not made demands that weren't mine to make. And the first time I have a genuine human moment with another person, you make a phone call and erase him." Cassian stood. He moved from behind the desk. Not quickly, not with aggression, but with the deliberate weight of a man who understood that the space between them needed addressing. He stopped 6 feet away, the distance he always kept. "I keep you safe," he said. "That is the one thing I have committed to without exception." "From what?" Her voice rose on the second word and she let it. "From a baker? From someone who carried my groceries and talked about his sourdough and asked nothing from me and wanted nothing from me and treated me like I was a normal person having a normal Tuesday morning? That is the threat you identified?" "The threat," Cassian said, and his voice was very quiet, which was more unnerving than volume would have been, "is not him specifically. The threat is visibility. The threat is anyone watching you closely enough to notice that a certain kind of attention makes you light up. Because the people who want leverage on me are patient. They are not dramatic. They do not send obvious threats. They find the thing you respond to, and they cultivate it. They build it carefully, and then they use it. And by the time you realize what's happening, the person you trusted is standing in a room with a gun to their head, and you are being asked to make a choice. "So you made the choice for me," she said. "Yes." "Without asking me?" "Yes." She stared at him. The room was very quiet. Outside, wind moved through the garden with a sound like something being slowly torn. She could hear her own heartbeat, not elevated, not panicked, but measured and deliberate in the way of something that had been running a long time and knew how to pace itself. "You protected my body," she said slowly, "while abandoning my heart for 2 years. And you're standing in front of me right now telling me that was the correct decision." Something shifted in Cassian's face. It was not the shift of a man being broken. It was the shift of a man recognizing that the architecture he had been certain about has a flaw he cannot engineer around. He opened his mouth, closed it. A muscle worked in his jaw. "I did what I calculated was necessary," he said. "I know," Vivian said. "That's the problem." She turned and walked out of the study. She did not slam the door. Slamming doors was for people who still had enough emotional investment to want the noise. She pulled it shut with the quiet, final click of someone who was no longer certain they had anything left to invest, and she walked down the corridor with her coat still on and went into the East Wing studio and sat at the drafting table and did not draw anything for 2 hours. She just sat, breathing. The next 3 weeks were the worst of the 2 years. Not because anything overtly changed. The household ran as it always ran. Dinners appeared when they were supposed to appear. Cassian was present at 2 of them and absent at 4. And when he was present, he was civil and contained and said nothing about what had happened in the study. But the silence between them had a different quality now. It had gone from the neutral silence of an arrangement to something with an edge, something that pressed. Vivienne began sleeping poorly. Not dramatically. No nightmares, no 3 a.m. spirals. But she woke at 5 most mornings and could not return to sleep, and she lay in the pale dark of her enormous room and stared at the ceiling and added up the inventory of her life, with the clear-eyed accounting of someone who has stopped flinching from the numbers. 28 years old when she entered this house. 30 now. 2 years of work she was proud of, work she had built herself in the studio regardless of circumstances. 2 friendships that were real, a level of financial security she could not have constructed on her own, and a marriage that was, by any honest measure, an exquisitely maintained fiction. She had been willing to accept the fiction when she believed it was temporary. When she believed that Cassian's distance was a wall she might eventually dismantle if she was patient and careful and did not push. She had been operating, she understood now, on the assumption that the arrangement would gradually soften, that proximity would do what proximity usually did, wear down the angles, establish rhythms, create the small unconscious intimacies that accumulate into something recognizable as a life shared. That had not happened. It was not going to happen. The Baker incident had made that clear in a way 2 years of quieter evidence had not. Because what Cassian had done with Owen Mercer was not the action of a man slowly opening, it was the action of a man who had seen the smallest possible crack in his system and moved immediately to seal it. He was not thawing. He was maintaining. And she was 30 years old and she was lonely and she was done. She made the decision on a Wednesday morning with her coffee going cold in front of her and the garden outside the terrace beginning to go pale and bare with November coming. It arrived not as an emotional explosion, but as the quiet settlement of something that had been suspended for too long, the way a held breath finally releases. Simply, without drama. Because the body knows before the mind does that it cannot continue. She called Dana.
I need a place to stay, she said, for a while. Maybe longer than a while. A pause. Then Dana said, My guest room is yours. You don't have to explain anything. I will explain, Vivian said, just not today. Okay. She spent the afternoon in the studio finishing a project she had promised a client, because she was not the kind of woman who left things undone. She emailed the completed drawings, cleared her drafting table with methodical care, and spent 20 minutes looking at the space she had built inside the space she had been given. The pencils arranged by grade, the reference book she had selected herself, the small print of a building she loved pinned above the monitor, and felt the precise weight of leaving something that had been genuinely hers, even inside a life that hadn't been. She packed one suitcase, not because she had to, she could have taken more, there was no one to stop her, but because one suitcase felt like the honest size of what she was carrying out of this marriage, what was actually hers, what she had arrived with and built and not been given. She was at the bottom of the main staircase, coat on, suitcase in hand, when she heard him. He was coming from the direction of the east corridor, moving faster than she had ever seen him move, which was still not running, but which carried the quality of urgency in a body built for restraint. He stopped at the base of the stairs 8 feet away and looked at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She had seen Cassian Volkov in negotiations that turned violent. She had seen him receive phone calls that ended with the color leaving his face and returning before anyone else in the room noticed. She had seen him at 2 in the morning in the kitchen drinking water in the dark with the specific stillness of a man who had seen things he was working to unsee. She had catalogued every version of him that she had been permitted to observe. She had never seen him look afraid. Where? He said. The word came out wrong, clipped at the edges in a way that sounded like the word had cost him something. Dana's, she said. For now. Vivian, I'm not angry, she said, which was true, and which she needed him to understand was true. I'm not doing this because of the baker. I'm doing this because 2 years ago you told me you would keep me safe, and you have kept that promise exactly. And I have tried. I have genuinely tried to find a way to build something inside the terms you set. But I cannot spend another year being kept. I'm not an artifact, Cassian. I'm not something that needs to be preserved in controlled conditions. I'm a person who needs... She stopped, breathed. I need to be someone's. Not something someone protects, someone's, and I cannot be yours because you will not let me. She picked up the suitcase. His hand closed around her wrist. Not hard. Nothing like force. The grip of a man who had spent 2 years keeping a precise and deliberate distance and was now breaching it with the single most uncharacteristic gesture she could have imagined from him. His hand was warm. That surprised her. She had somehow expected cold, and the warmth of it hit her somewhere undefended, and she stopped moving without deciding to. He said, Please, one word. And in the mouth of a man who had never said it, not to rivals, not to allies, not to anyone in any negotiation or confrontation in an adult life built entirely around the management of power, it landed with a weight that seemed physically impossible for a single syllable. She did not look at him. She looked at the front door, which was 12 feet away and which represented the cleaner, more honest version of her future, and she felt his grip on her wrist and heard the words still echoing in the marble entry and understood with terrible clarity that what happened in the next 30 seconds was going to define something that could not be. She looked at his hand on her wrist. Not at his face, she wasn't ready for his face, but at the hand itself. The knuckles, the tendons visible beneath the skin from the grip, not tight enough to hurt, but present enough to be undeniable. She had spent 2 years in proximity to those hands, and they had never touched her. Not once. Not accidentally. Not in the automatic, thoughtless way that bodies in shared domestic space inevitably make contact. He had been precise about it. Religious in his avoidance, which was the only word that fit the discipline it must have required. And now here they were. She said, without turning, Let go of my wrist, Cassian. No. The word surprised her enough that she did look at him then. His jaw was set. His eyes, dark, unwilling to blink, were doing the thing she had noticed in his most controlled moments, that quality of absolute focus that felt less like attention and more like pressure. He was breathing through his nose with the deliberate rhythm of a man managing something that had gotten larger than he expected.
You said please, she said. I heard it. But please is not a plan. Please is not 2 years of a different kind of marriage. Please is just the word you use when you've run out of every other option and the thing you've been pretending not to want is walking out the door. I know what it is, he said. Then what are you asking for? He released her wrist. Not because she'd told him to, the timing was wrong for that, too deliberate, but because he seemed to need his hands back for whatever he was about to do, which turned out to be nothing except standing very still in the marble entry with the weight of the house around him and looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not softness. It wasn't that. It was something rawer than softness. Something that hadn't been processed into anything presentable yet. One conversation, he said. Not a negotiation, not a set of terms, just sit down with me for 1 hour and let me tell you what I have not told you. And then if you still want to leave, I will call a car myself. Vivienne stood with her suitcase in her hand and the front door 12 feet away and thought about Dana's guest room, which had a window that faced east and a quilt that smelled like cedar and a kind of quiet that was chosen rather than imposed. She thought about what it would feel like to sleep in a room where the silence was hers. She set the suitcase down. 1 hour, she said. They sat in the room she thought of as the gray room, a small sitting room off the main corridor that no one used with any regularity, furnished with 2 chairs and a low table and bookshelves that held reference texts no one read. It had no particular history for either of them, which was perhaps why Cassian chose it. Neutral ground inside an unneutral house. He did not sit immediately. He stood at the window for a moment with his back to her, and she watched the set of his shoulders and understood that whatever he was about to say had a cost she couldn't calculate from the outside. Then he sat, and he talked. Not fluidly, not in the organized, linear way he presented information in every other context she had observed. He talked the way people talk when they're excavating something that has been buried long enough to become structural, with gaps and restarts, and moments where he stopped and breathed and looked at a point somewhere past her left shoulder rather than at her face. He had been 23 when his mother died. He said this the way you say a fact about weather, flat, no inflection. But his right hand pressed flat against his knee in a way that contradicted the flatness of his voice. A car accident, he said, and then corrected himself. Not an accident. A message. From a man his father had wronged in a business arrangement that had gone sideways 3 years earlier. The man had waited, had been patient, had chosen his moment. His mother had been returning from visiting a friend and she never arrived, and Cassian had spent 6 hours not knowing before someone called. He was running errands for his father's organization at 23. Low level. He had not yet become what he eventually became, but the trajectory was already set, and after his mother he had understood something that could not be unlearned. Proximity to him was a liability. That the people who loved him, or who appeared to love him, or who could be used to simulate love being threatened, those people were not protected by his capability. They were targeted by it. He had loved a woman at 25. He did not say her name. She had been taken by people who wanted something from Cassian's father, and she had been returned eventually, but not intact in the ways that mattered most. And she had left the city, and he had not tried to stop her because stopping her would have meant she stayed near him, and he had understood by then what that meant. After that, he had made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not a vow of any kind. Nothing that required ceremony. Simply a recalibration of his internal architecture. He would not allow connection. He would not permit anyone close enough to become a weapon against him. He would be effective, and he would be powerful, and he would keep everyone at the precise distance required to ensure they could not be used. And then your father needed a solution, he said. He was looking at her now, direct, unwilling to take the easier angle. And I needed a wife who would not require what I could not give, someone intelligent enough to manage the arrangement and contained enough not to try to break it. Your father described you as... I know how my father described me, Vivienne said. Get to the part I don't know. A pause. Something moved through his expression. Not quite shame, but its structural relative. 3 months after the wedding, he said, I received intelligence that a family operating out of the Northeast, the Dravik organization, had identified you as a potential pressure point. They had been watching the estate. They had taken photographs. They had constructed a profile. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document, which he set on the low table between them but did not push toward her. They knew you went to the market on Tuesdays. They knew which gallery you visited with your friend. They knew the route your car took. They had 4 months of your movement patterns. Vivian looked at the document. She did not touch it. You knew this when? 14 months ago. The number landed like something physical. She counted backward through the past 14 months. The dinners, the galas, the Tuesday markets, the gallery visits with Dana, all of it, and felt the retroactive presence of eyes she hadn't known were there settle over the memory of each one like a layer of contamination. You didn't tell me, she said. No. Why? Because the moment you knew, your behavior would change. And changed behavior is visible to people who are watching for exactly that change. The safest version of you was the version that didn't know she was being watched. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You made that decision alone. Yes. About my safety. About what I was allowed to know about my own situation. Alone. Yes. She stood up. Not with drama, not with any particular speed, but with the clarity of someone whose body has made a decision slightly ahead of their mind. She walked to the bookshelf and stood looking at the spines of books she had never read, and she breathed carefully, because the alternative to breathing carefully was something she did not want to do in front of him. The Dravik organization, she said. Are they still watching? That situation was resolved 8 months ago. Resolved. Their leadership made certain decisions that had consequences. The organization no longer functions in any meaningful capacity. She turned. And what about now? Is there a current threat? Is there someone watching my Tuesday mornings right now? He took a half-second too long to answer. There is always a current threat at some general level. That is not what I asked you. No, he said. There is no specific active intelligence on you at this time. She nodded once, slowly. So for the past 6 months, there has been no specific threat to me. And you have continued to maintain the same distance, the same rules, the same arrangement. She paused. Because the threat was never really the only reason, was it? It was not a question. He heard the distinction. No, he said. It was not the only reason. You're afraid, she said. Not of them. Of this. She gestured between them with one hand. Of what happens if you stop keeping the distance. Because the distance is the only thing that has ever made sense to you, and the idea of not having it. She stopped. Something was shifting in the quality of the room's silence. Not the content of what Cassian was, she had known the shape of him for 2 years, but the context of it, the revelation of the specific history that had built him. And with that, the arrival of a feeling she deeply resented in this moment, which was understanding. She did not want to understand him right now. Understanding him made leaving geometrically more complicated. She was still reaching for what she wanted to say next when her phone buzzed. Dana's name on the screen. She almost declined it. The timing was wrong. Everything about this moment was wrong for interruption. But Dana did not call without reason, and something in the quality of the buzz, the repetition of it, made her answer. Dana. Viv. Dana's voice was wrong, clipped and low in the way of someone managing their own fear with both hands. I need you to listen to me and not react. Are you with him right now? Vivian's eyes went to Cassian without planning to. Yes. Okay, good. Stay there. A breath. The sound of movement, a door closing somewhere on Dana's end. I had a visitor today, about an hour ago. A man I didn't know. He came to the gallery, not as a customer. He didn't even look at the work. He just walked in and stood at the counter and said he needed to get a message to Vivian Ashcroft, and he knew we were friends. Vivian's hand tightened on the phone. What message? He said, and I'm repeating this exactly, Viv, because I've been going over it in my head since he left. He said to tell you that the situation with your husband is more complicated than you know, and that if you were planning to leave, you should wait. He said there's something happening tonight that changes things. A pause. Then he left. He didn't give me a name. He didn't threaten me. He just said it like it was a courtesy. Vivian turned away from Cassian and walked to the far end of the gray room by the door. She lowered her voice. What did he look like? Dana described him, mid-40s, short gray hair, a scar at the corner of his left eye, shaped like a bracket. Compact build, moved like someone accustomed to being the person in the room with the most situational awareness. Vivian said, "Did he say anything else?"
He said one more thing.
Another pause, longer this time. He said, "Tell her to ask her husband who gave the Dravik family her Tuesday schedule." The room went very still. Not actually still. She could hear Cassian behind her, the slight shift of weight, the controlled breathing, but still in the way of a moment just before the specific shape of a disaster becomes fully visible. She stood with the phone at her ear and looked at the closed door and ran the sentence through her mind again without wanting to. Ask her husband who gave the Dravik family her Tuesday schedule. She turned around. Cassian was watching her with that focused stillness of his, the quality that she had learned to read as processing rather than calm. And for the first time in 2 years, she could not determine what he was processing. Whether he had heard enough to understand what Dana had said, whether the expression on his face, tight, attentive, the jaw set with a rigidity she associated with things going wrong in his world, was the expression of a man who recognized what was coming.
"I have to go," she said into the phone. "Viv, I'll call you in an hour. Stay at the gallery. Don't go home." She ended the call. She looked at Cassian across the small room with its unread books and its neutral furniture, and she said, in a voice she kept completely level because leveling her voice was the one thing she had complete control over. "Who gave the Dravik family my Tuesday schedule?"
The half-second pause returned. The same one as before. She marked it this time, measured it, understood what it meant in the syntax of a man who always knew exactly what to say. "Where did you hear that?" he said. "Answer the question." "Vivian, answer the question." He stood. He moved to the window, not away from her, not with the body language of avoidance, but with the restless energy of a man calculating at speed. She waited. The waiting was the hardest part, the interval between the question and the answer in which the answer was already assembling itself from every small inconsistency she had filed away over 2 years without knowing why she was filing them. The 14 months of known surveillance. The speed with which the Dravik situation had been resolved. The intelligence that had known her schedule with a specificity that suggested it had not come from external observation, but from internal information. The file on Owen Mercer, assembled in less than 48 hours with a level of detail that required not just access, but sources who were close. "One of your own people," she said. The words came out with a clarity that surprised even her. "The schedule didn't come from someone watching me from outside. It came from someone inside this house. Someone in your organization gave them my movements." She stopped. The next piece arrived with a nauseating precision. "And you know who it was?" Cassian turned from the window. His face had undergone a change she had no category for. It was not the controlled blankness of his professional register. It was not the constrained emotional temperature of their domestic life. It was something stripped down and unguarded in a way that frightened her precisely because he was not a man who became unguarded. "My second," he said. "Roark." The name meant nothing to her. She said so. "My most senior lieutenant. He has been with the organization for 12 years. He said it with the flat precision of someone reading a casualty report. "I have suspected for 4 months. I have been building the case because moving against Rourke without sufficient evidence would fracture the organization in ways that would leave it, in you, exposed. I needed time." "He gave them my schedule," Vivian said. "Yes." "While you were protecting me from the threat he was generating." "Yes." She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. Not to suppress sound, why, she wasn't close to sound, but because the gesture was the only physical expression equal to what was moving through her. She had spent 2 years inside an arrangement she understood and had adapted to. She had spent this evening arriving at the decision to leave it on her own terms, with clarity and without drama. And now the architecture of everything, the reasons for the distance, the logic of the protection, the shape of the threat itself, had been retroactively restructured around a betrayal that had been inside the walls the entire time. She had been the unknowing center of a war between Cassian and his own most trusted lieutenant. For 4 months, while setting her suitcase by the front door and sitting in this neutral room, listening to him excavate his history. "Tonight," she said. "Dana said something is happening tonight." "What is happening tonight?" Cassian crossed to the desk in the corner of the room. She hadn't registered it as his desk, had assumed the room was unused, but the drawer he opened was unlocked and he knew exactly where it was. And he retrieved a phone she had not seen before. He read something from it, and his face did a thing she had never witnessed. Every managed feature, every constructed layer of professional control, compressed into something that was pure and undisguised and cold in the specific way of a man confronting the worst version of what he had been afraid of. He looked at her and said, "Rourke knows you're leaving. He has people positioned at Dana's building." The floor did not actually move. She knew this, but her body processed the information with a slight physical lurch, a rebalancing, as though the solid surface beneath her had briefly renegotiated its relationship with gravity. "He was going to let me walk out," she said. "He was going to let me go to Dana's and—" "He doesn't want you at Dana's," Cassian said. His voice had gone to a register she had heard once before. At a dinner, 2 years ago, when someone had called during dessert, and he had excused himself and returned 8 minutes later with a tone that cleared the room. "He wants you in transit, between here and there. No security because you left on your own. No protocols because tonight was not a planned departure." He set the phone down. "He has been waiting for exactly this." Vivian stood in this gray room with its unread books and its neutral furniture and understood with complete, terrible clarity that her decision to leave had been the trigger. That the timing of her departure, emotional, unplanned, stripped of the careful protocols that governed every other aspect of her life in this house, was precisely the vulnerability Rourke had been cultivating for 4 months. She had been the plan. Her loneliness had been the plan. She thought about Owen Mercer, about the 8 minutes at the market, and felt something corrosive move through her as she considered the new possibility that what had looked like a spontaneous human moment might have been seeded deliberately. A kindness engineered to accelerate her sense of deprivation, to push her faster toward the door. She looked at Cassian. Did Rourke know about the baker? The answer was in his face before he spoke. And she had learned to read his face. "Yes," Cassian said. One word. The most destructive word she had heard in 2 years, and she had heard him say things in that time that should have ranked higher. She stood in the gray room and felt the specific quality of what the word dismantled. Not just the memory of the market, not just the 8 minutes with Owen and the sourdough and the uncomplicated human warmth of it, but the last clean thing she had believed about her life inside these walls. That her loneliness, at least, had been genuinely hers. That the deprivation had been real even if its dimensions were managed. That the moment of laughing in the cold autumn air had been an accident of the world being occasionally generous. It had been a gear in someone else's mechanism. "How long?" she said. Rourke identified the Mercer angle 6 weeks before it happened. Owen Mercer was not a plant. He's exactly what he appeared to be. And what happened at the market was real. But Rourke had people watching you for months by then, and when he saw the interaction, he recognized its utility. Cassian's voice was doing its stripped-down thing, factual and bleak. He did not manufacture the moment. He simply waited for it to develop, then accelerated the conditions around it. When I moved Mercer out of the city, I did what Rourke predicted I would do. And it did what Rourke predicted it would do to you. It made me angrier, she said. It made you closer to the door. She turned away from him. She needed 10 seconds where she wasn't looking at his face, where her eyes could rest on something without history. The neutral shelving, the unremarkable wall, while she ran Rourke's operation through her mind from the beginning. 4 months of known betrayal. 12 years before that of proximity and apparent loyalty. A man who had watched Cassian manage the distance from his wife with professional detachment and had identified, with cold precision, that the distance itself was the vulnerability, not a weapon aimed at Cassian directly, a slow-acting one aimed at the structure holding everything together. At her. She turned back. What does he want? Control of the Eastern operations. The harbor contracts. 3 lieutenants have already been approached. I know of 2 who declined and 1 who didn't. He was moving now, not with agitation, but with the contained efficiency of a man who had been waiting for a trigger and felt it arrive. He crossed to the door, opened it, said something in a low voice to whoever was standing in the corridor outside. She heard the response. A male voice, one of the security staff, and the sound of rapid movement away from the door. Cassian turned back. We need to move you, not to Dana's. Dana, Vivian said immediately. If Rourke has people at her building, I'm handling that. Don't tell me you're handling it. Tell me what that means. He looked at her with something that on a different night, in a different version of this marriage, she might have called respect. Two of my people are 30 seconds from her gallery right now. She will be moved to a secondary location before Rourke's team has any reason to redirect to her. She'll be frightened. Yes, you'll tell her what she needs to know. My people will tell her what keeps her calm and what keeps her moving. That may not be the same as what she needs to know. That is not good enough, Vivian said. She is my friend, Cassian, not a... I know who she is. His voice came down a register, not with anger, but with the weight of someone carrying too many simultaneous calculations. I know she matters to you. I know this is not the way you would choose to manage this. I'm telling you what is possible in the next 4 minutes. And the version of this that keeps Dana safest requires her to move before she has time to ask questions that would slow the process. Vivian breathed. Fine. Where are you moving me? Here. She stared at him. This house is the most defensible position I have. My security infrastructure here is not matched by anything else in the city. If Rourke intended to move against you in transit, keeping you inside the estate eliminates that avenue entirely. He reached into his jacket for the secondary phone again, read something, typed something without looking away from her. It also tells him the plan failed, which will force him to move faster than he intended. And moving faster than intended is when people make errors. You're going to make him come to you. I'm going to make him feel like he has no choice. She understood then, not just the tactical logic, but the deeper architecture of it. Cassian was not playing defense. He had never, she suspected, played defense in his adult life. What looked like containment and caution and careful distance was something she was revising in real time. It was positioning, all of it, even perhaps including the parts that had cost her the most. She was not certain she forgave that, but she filed the revision. What do you need from me? She said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she didn't have a name for. Then he said, Stay visible. Inside the house, on the ground floor, in rooms with windows that face the front approach. Don't close the curtains. You want him to see I'm still here. I want his people watching the perimeter to report back that you're still here, unguarded, apparently. And when he comes, he will not come himself. He will send people first. That is how men like Rourke operate. They preserve their own position until the outcome is sufficiently certain. Something moved through his face, cold and flat and absolute. He has miscalculated what sufficiently certain looks like from inside this house. The next 40 minutes had the quality of a held breath extended past the point where the body normally insists on release. Vivian moved through the ground floor of the estate with a deliberateness that required more of her than she would have admitted. The front sitting room, the kitchen, the hallway that ran the length of the east wing with its tall windows looking onto the driveway approach. She did not perform normalcy. That would have read as false from the outside. She simply occupied the spaces as herself, moving with her own natural rhythm, pausing to stand at windows without pressing close to them. She was bait. She understood this clearly and had agreed to it clearly, and she was still working to keep her heartbeat from registering in the base of her throat with every pass through a room that had exterior exposure. Cassian was not visible. This was deliberate. His people, 8 of them, she had counted the brief silent movements in the corridors when she passed through, were distributed through the house in positions she couldn't fully map, but trusted were not random. Torres was somewhere near the back of the ground floor. Mrs. Caldwell had been moved to the basement apartment and told to stay. The house had the surface quiet of any other evening and the subsurface pressure of a system fully loaded and waiting. At 11:43, a window in the east corridor went dark. Not dramatically. No explosion, no sound. The exterior light that normally illuminated the driveway approach simply stopped. 1 second present, the next absent. She registered it from the corner of her eye and kept walking and did not alter her pace. 30 seconds later, the lights in the entrance hall went out. The generator took 4 seconds to engage, which she knew because Cassian had told her it would be 4 seconds, and to stay still and not move toward any exterior door when it happened. She stood in the dark of the east corridor and counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the emergency lighting came up, lower wattage and amber-toned, reshaping every familiar room into something that looked like itself but colder. She heard the first sound of entry from the south side of the house. A door, not broken, which told her they had a key. which told her the depth of Rourke's penetration into the household. A door with a key. 12 years of access. She pressed herself into the alcove beside the corridor bookcase and breathed through her nose and felt her pulse in her wrists. Then she heard Cassian's voice from the direction of the main hall. Not loud, clear.
There are 4 of you in this house right now. The man who came through the south door has already been detained. There is 1 at the top of the kitchen stairs. There are 2 in the east corridor, one of whom is approximately 8 feet from my wife. Silence. I am giving you a choice that Rourke would not give you if your positions were reversed. Set down whatever you're carrying and put your hands where my people can see them, and you will leave this house in working condition. Do not, and you will leave in the only other available configuration. A beat of silence long enough to have its own weight. Then a sound, metallic, the specific sound of something heavy set on a hardwood floor. From the corridor to her left. Then another from above. Then, from her right, the sound of voices. Low and urgent and not directed at her, followed by rapid movement that had the quality of trained people redirecting themselves efficiently toward a new objective. She did not move from the alcove. The 8 feet between her and the east corridor felt like either a very short or a very long distance, and she could not decide which. A figure appeared at the end of the corridor, moving fast, not with the controlled pace of someone who had heard Cassian's speech, but with the desperate momentum of someone who had decided that the situation had deteriorated past the point where cooperation was the best available option. Male, large, moving with his weight forward in a way that meant he was committed to the direction. Vivienne made a decision in a fraction of a second that was less a decision than an instinct compounded by 2 years of living inside the logic of threat assessment by proximity. She stepped out of the alcove into the corridor directly into the figure's path and threw her elbow upward as the training she had done 10 years ago as a precaution and largely forgotten surfaced with the sudden vividness of physical memory. She made contact with something solid. Pain ricocheted up through her forearm to her shoulder. The figure staggered sideways, hit the bookcase, sent 3 years of accumulated reference text to the floor with a crash that seemed enormous in the quiet house. Then Torres was there, and 2 other people she didn't know, and the corridor was loud for 30 seconds, and then quiet again. She stood against the wall with her arm held against her chest, and her heart doing something arrhythmic and aggressive in her sternum, and her elbow registering a sharp, sustained complaint that she was already in the process of deciding was not serious enough to require attention right now. Cassian appeared from the direction of the main hall, moving at a speed she had not previously seen him move. He stopped 2 feet from her, and his eyes went immediately to her arm. "I'm fine," she said. "You're holding your arm." "Because it hurts." "I said I'm fine." She straightened from the wall with more composure than she actually possessed. "What happened to the other 3? He looked at her for 1 more second with an expression she didn't have time to analyze, then, "Detained. My people are—" His secondary phone went off. He answered it before the second vibration, listened for 4 seconds without speaking, and something in his face went through a transition she watched happen in real time. From controlled to something underneath that register, something colder and more absolute than anything she had seen from him in 2 years. He ended the call. "Rourke is not sending more people," he said. "How do you know?" "Because he just moved to a secondary plan." He looked at her, and there was something in the look she was not prepared for. An apology, she realized, which she had not known his face could do. "He has your father." The words rearranged the room. Edmund Ashcroft, who had no security because he was no longer a senator, because he had spent 14 months quietly and gratefully disappearing from the public life that had damaged him, because he lived now in the brownstone that the Volkov arrangement had preserved for him with a housekeeper who came 3 days a week and a routine that was thoroughly unremarkable, who had never been part of the calculation because no one with strategic sense would use a fallen, embarrassed former official as leverage against the most feared crime organization in the city. Unless they understood that the crime organization's most significant vulnerability was not operational, but personal. Unless they had watched for 2 years and understood that the woman at the center of the arrangement, whatever else she was a daughter who had walked into this marriage for exactly 1 reason. "He wants a meeting," Cassian said. "Rourke, not his people. Him, direct." "Where?"
The Harlan Building, the Foundation Gala? Tonight. Vivian knew the gala. She had attended it last year on Cassian's arm, a charity function in a building of glass and steel on the north side of the city, the kind of event where the guest list was a carefully curated intersection of money and legitimacy. The kind of event where Rourke would have cover, where the presence of 100 civilian witnesses would make overt violence impossible and leverage infinitely easier, where Cassian, arriving alone, would be walking into a room Rourke had designed. "He wants you there without protection," she said. It was not a question. "He wants me there with you." Cassian's jaw was tight enough that she could see the muscle working beneath the skin. "Both of us. Together. Public. Which means either he wants the image, wants the city's network to see him force me to walk into a room on his terms, or he wants something that requires both of us present to—" "He wants to end it," Vivian said. "In public, in front of witnesses, in a way that makes it look like whatever he does next is either an accident or a consequence of a situation you created." She pressed her good hand flat against the corridor wall and felt the cool plaster and thought with the cold clarity she had been using all evening, the clarity that had arrived somewhere around the moment Dana called and had not left. "He wants to be there when you find out your wife chose to leave and it ended badly. Or he wants to be there when I walk back in and the whole city sees that the marriage is real, and the man who built a case against him for 4 months has decided his wife comes first." "Either version serves his story," Cassian said. "Yes." She looked at him. "We can't let him write the story." "No." "Then we write it first." Something shifted in Cassian's expression. She had seen him receive tactical suggestions from his people, had observed it from the periphery at gala dinners, where a quiet word would cause a visible recalibration, and she had never been the source of one. He was looking at her now with an attention that was different from every previous version of his attention, because it wasn't the attention of a man observing a woman he had agreed to protect. It was the attention of a man who had just understood he was looking at a partner. "Tell me," he said. She told him. It took 6 minutes. He asked 2 questions, sharp and operational, and she answered them. And he made 2 calls while she was still talking, adjusting as she spoke, integrating without pause. And when she finished, he stood in the amber-lit corridor of the house that had been her particular prison for 2 years and said, "If this works, it will work," she said. Not with the false confidence of someone who needed to believe, with the flat certainty of someone who had spent 3 years as an architectural consultant, understanding how structures failed and exactly where you needed to apply pressure to make them fail in a controlled direction. "If it works," he said again, "you need to understand that you will be in that room when it happens, in front of Rourke, in front of his people, in front of everyone who still believes the story he has been building. I understand that. There will be a moment where he will try to use the marriage against me, against both of us. He will say things in public that are designed to—" "I know what he'll say," she said. "He'll say what he's watched us be for 2 years. He'll say the marriage is a transaction, that I'm kept, that you don't care whether I stay or go, which is why I was walking out the door tonight." She looked at him steadily. "He'll say it because it was true." Cassian was quiet. "It was true," she said again. Not to wound, because honesty was the only available foundation for what the next 3 hours required. And the only way to make his version of it useless is to walk into that room as something that isn't what he saw for 2 years. "I am asking you to do something very difficult," Cassian said. "I know what you're asking. You were leaving tonight." "I was." She reached for her coat from the chair where she had set it down what felt like a geological age ago. "I'll make a decision about that after we deal with Rourke." She looked at him across the corridor with its fallen books and its amber light and the particular texture of 2 years of distance between them beginning, in this moment, to look like something that might be navigable from the other side. "Right now we have my father in a building across the city and a man who has been patient for 12 years and thinks he's finally gotten everything positioned correctly." She put on the coat. "So let's go disappoint him." The car moved through the city with Cassian beside her and Torres in the front, and the darkened street sliding past the tinted windows, and Vivian sat with her injured elbow held carefully against her side, and her heart doing its new arrhythmic thing, and she looked out at the lights, and understood that the version of her life she had been trying to leave an hour ago was not the version she was driving back into, and that the version she was driving toward was not yet legible to her, but that it existed and that the man beside her, silent, watchful, his hand resting on the seat between them, with the palm turned upward in what she recognized as the quietest possible version of an offering, was also moving toward something not yet legible. She reached out and put her hand in his. He closed his fingers around hers without hesitation, without the old precision of maintained distance, without calculation, just closed them. The Harlan building rose ahead of them through the rain-wet windshield, all glass and vertical light, and inside it, on the 14th floor, Rourke was positioned with his story already written and her father sitting somewhere as the final punctuation. Torres said quietly from the front seat, 2 minutes. Cassian's grip on her hand tightened by a degree. She looked at the building and thought about the architectural principle of controlled demolition, about how you do not destroy a structure by attacking it at its strongest point, but by identifying the precise load-bearing element whose removal causes the entire thing to come down in the direction you choose. She knew exactly which element that was. She knew because she had been watching Rourke's structure from the inside for 2 years without knowing she was watching it. And the load-bearing element was not Cassian, and it was not the organization, and it was not the 12 years of accumulated loyalty that had curdled into betrayal. It was the assumption that she would be passive. The car stopped. Torres opened the door, and the city air came in, cold and smelling of rain, and the particular metallic edge of a night that was already deciding what it was going to become. And Vivian stepped out onto the wet pavement of the Harlan building's entrance, with Cassian's hand still in hers, and the light from the lobby falling across both of them in a way that anyone watching from inside would be able to see clearly. And she thought, good. Let them see. The lobby doors opened, and they walked in together. And the lobby of the Harlan building was exactly the kind of space designed to make people feel watched, without knowing who was doing the watching. Vivian had been here before. Last year, on Cassian's arm, wearing the navy dress that Mrs. Caldwell had selected and which fit her like a second opinion about who she was supposed to be. She remembered the geometry of it, the vaulted atrium, the twin banks of elevators along the north wall, the mezzanine level where the Foundation's gala occupied the entire 14-floor ballroom with its floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the city's northern quarter. She remembered thinking that the building's architect had understood something important about visibility and had built the whole structure around it, every angle calibrated to ensure that anyone moving through the space could be observed from multiple positions simultaneously. She had thought it was an aesthetic choice. She understood now it was a power choice. The elevator ride to the 14th floor lasted 41 seconds. She counted them. Cassian stood beside her with their hands no longer connected. They had separated in the lobby, not with any signal between them, but with the mutual understanding that walking into the ballroom joined at the hand was a statement too legible, too easily read as performance. What they needed Rourke to see was not theater. Theater he would expect. Theater he had planned for. What they needed him to see was something he had not anticipated and could not quickly categorize. Torres had separated from them at the entrance, taking the stairwell with 2 others whose presence Vivian had registered but not examined. The elevator held only the 2 of them, and the mirrored walls returned their reflections from 3 directions. Vivian, in her coat, with her injured elbow tucked close, and her face doing the thing it did when she was carrying a significant internal weight without externally flagging it. Cassian in his jacket with the secondary phone in his breast pocket and his jaw set, at the angle she now recognized as operational rather than merely controlled. He said without looking away from the doors, "Your father is on the 14th floor, northeast corner, the private suite the Foundation uses for donors. Rourke has 2 people with him. Neither of them is Rourke. Rourke is in the ballroom. Yes. He'll want to see us arrive. Yes." She adjusted the angle of her coat collar with her good hand. "Then we arrive." The doors opened. The sound of the gala reached them before the image of it. The layered acoustic signature of 200 people in a high-ceilinged room. The crystalline percussion of glassware. The particular audio texture of wealth in a room enjoying itself. The ballroom stretched before them through a set of open glass doors, all candlelight and deep tablecloths, and the kind of floral arrangements that cost more than most people spent on furniture. At the far end, a small ensemble was playing something that the room was successfully ignoring. Vivienne walked in. She had done this before, entered rooms like this on Cassian's arm with the practiced composure of a woman who had learned that the most effective armor was simply appearing to require none. But something was different in her body tonight. Some internal calibration had shifted, and it took her 3 steps into the room to identify what it was. She was not performing composure. She was not managing her presentation. She was simply moving through the room with the flat, quiet certainty of a woman who had already survived the worst hour of her night and had arrived here with a specific purpose and a very limited supply of tolerance for anything that was not that purpose. Several people looked. They always looked at galas like this. Looked at who arrived with whom and what that meant, and what had changed since the last time they had been in a room together. Vivian registered the looks the way she registered background noise and continued toward the northeast corner of the ballroom where the private suite doors stood closed. She felt Cassian slightly behind her left shoulder. She felt, from somewhere in the room she had not yet located, the quality of being watched by someone who was watching specifically and with intent. She found Rourke at the bar. He was not what she had constructed in her mind during the car ride over. She had expected something more overtly predatory. A larger physical presence, a face with the architecture of someone who had spent 12 years deciding which loyalties to keep and which to leverage. He was instead compact and gray-haired, mid-50s, with the kind of unremarkable face that would vanish from memory the moment you stopped looking at it. The scar at the corner of his left eye, the detail Dana had given her, was small, shaped like a bracket, easy to miss. He held a glass of something amber and stood at the bar with the relaxed posture of a man who had arrived early and gotten comfortable with the geography. He looked at her, then past her to Cassian, then back to her. He smiled. It did not reach the eyes, which were doing something precise and analytical that she recognized because she had seen the same quality in Cassian's eyes for 2 years and had learned to treat it as a weather system to be respected. "Mrs. Volkov," he said, as though they were acquaintances, as though this were an ordinary Tuesday at an ordinary gala. "Rourke," she said. Not sir, not Mr. anything, just the name, stripped of every courtesy. Something adjusted in his expression, slight. She filed it. Cassian stopped beside her. The 2 men looked at each other with the specific quality of people who have known each other across a long and now irreversible threshold, and the quality of that look was so dense with history and damage that Vivian felt the weight of it as a physical thing standing next to it. "You should know," Cassian said, his voice completely level, "that your people in the estate have been detained. All 4. The 2 you had positioned at the gallery building were redirected by my people before they reached the door." He paused. "And the federal agent you've been speaking to for the past 7 months is not, in fact, a federal agent." Rourke's hand tightened on his glass by a degree too small for anyone more than a foot away to register. Vivian was less than a foot away. "That's a significant claim," Rourke said. "It's a significant situation." Cassian's voice carried no heat. Heat was for people who needed emphasis because their words lacked it independently. "The man you've been feeding information to is a private intelligence contractor who's been working for the Dravek family's successor organization for 11 months. Everything you gave him believing it would result in federal protection for your transition, every operation, every account, every name, went directly to the people who have most reason to use it against both of us." A silence of about 3 seconds, in which Rourke's face did nothing externally and everything internally. "You were played," Cassian said, "by people who were patient enough to construct a convincing federal identity and wait for someone with sufficient access and sufficient grievance to make use of them. And you were patient enough to be exactly what they needed." Vivian watched Rourke absorb this. She watched the specific sequence of it, the first instant of rejection, the automatic refusal of information that fundamentally restructures a plan you have been executing for months, followed by the slower arrival of the details that confirm it, the cascade of recontextualization. He was good at managing his face, but she had become, without planning it, an expert reader of managed faces. He was recalculating, quickly. She could see him doing it. "The suite," she said. Both men looked at her. "My father. I want him out of that room before this conversation goes any further." Rourke looked at her with an assessment she did not flinch from. "Your father is perfectly comfortable." "I didn't ask about his comfort. I said I want him out of that room." A beat.
Then Rourke produced his own phone, typed something, and set it on the bar. 30 seconds later, the private suite door at the northeast corner of the ballroom opened and Edmund Ashcroft walked out. He was 71 years old, and he had aged in the past 14 months in the way of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally set it down, which produced not relief, but the particular exhaustion of muscles that had forgotten how to operate without the weight. He was dressed in a suit that fit him well, and his hair was slightly disordered, and when his eyes found Vivienne across the ballroom, they did the thing they had always done, filled with the complicated love of a man who knew exactly what his choices had cost his daughter, and had never, not once, found the courage to fully account for it to her face. She crossed to him. He gripped her arm when she reached him, and she let him, even though it was her injured elbow, because this was not the moment. "Are you hurt?" she said. "No." His voice was rough. "Vivienne, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't." "Later," she said. "We'll do all of that later." She looked at his face and took one inventory of him. Pulse visible at his temple, eyes clear, no signs of anything beyond fear, and the particular shame of a man who had needed rescuing from consequences he had set in motion 2 decades earlier and was still setting in motion now. "Can you walk to the elevator?" "Yes. Torres is going to come through that door in approximately 2 minutes. You go with him. You do exactly what he tells you. You do not stop to talk to anyone in this room." He looked past her at Cassian, then at Rourke at the bar, then back at her with an expression she didn't have time for. "Vivienne, Dad." She said it quietly, the way she had said it as a child when she needed him to stop being a senator and be her father for 30 seconds. It worked the same way it had always worked. Something in him simplified. "Go." He went. She walked back to the bar. Rourke had used the 90 seconds of her absence productively. She could see it in the reconfiguration of his posture. He had arrived at something, some new position, and he was settling into it with the practiced ease of a man who had always been better at adaptation than commitment. He looked at her with a quality she identified as revised assessment. "You're more operational than he lets you appear," Rourke said. "He doesn't manage my appearance," she said. "Maybe not." He glanced at Cassian. "The Dravex Succession Organization. That's a significant piece of intelligence to be sitting on." "I've been sitting on it for 6 weeks," Cassian said, "waiting for you to move so I had something to demonstrate to them about the cost of their methods." "You moved." He reached into his breast pocket, not for the phone, for a folded document, which he set on the bar with the deliberate economy of someone who has been waiting to place a specific object in a specific position. "That is a federal cooperation agreement, an actual one. The agent whose name is on the first page spent 4 years building a case against the Dravex Successor Network, and your 7 months of feeding them intelligence is documented in detail in what will be Exhibits 14 through 31. Rourke looked at the document without touching it. "The agreement has space for a second signature," Cassian said. "That space is currently empty. Whether it stays empty is the only decision that remains yours tonight." A long silence. At the far end of the ballroom, the ensemble was playing something no one was listening to. 200 people moved and talked and drank in the ambient light, and not one of them knew that the operational structure of the city's most significant criminal organization was being renegotiated 3 feet away over a bar. Rourke picked up the document. He read the first page with the methodical focus of a man who had not survived 12 years in this world by skimming. He read the second. He set it down and picked up his glass and drank from it, not nervously, but with the considered deliberateness of a man marking time between one version of his life and what comes after it. He said, "The 3 lieutenants I approached. 2 of whom told me immediately," Cassian said. "The 3rd is already in a conversation with the federal team. The harbor contracts. Remain where they are. Your name comes off them." Rourke set his glass down. He looked at the document. He looked at Cassian. He looked, finally, at Vivienne with an expression she could not fully read. Not quite respect, not quite resentment. Something older and more worn than either. "She's the one who told you about the contractor," he said. It was not a question. "I can see it. You didn't know until tonight. She worked it out." Cassian said nothing. "How?" Rourke said to Vivienne directly. She looked at him evenly. "You sent a man to Dana's gallery to deliver a message.
A warning, you framed it. Some courtesy, you likely believed, toward a civilian who hadn't chosen to be in this. But the message was too specific. It knew things that required internal access to know, and it arrived at exactly the moment that coincided with what was happening inside the estate. Internal timing, internal knowledge. You were running the whole operation from inside the organization's intelligence stream, which meant whoever you were feeding that stream to had access to the same information you did. She paused. A real federal operation wouldn't need a gallery visit. A real federal operation wouldn't need to send messages through a civilian friend. It would have a wire and a case number and an official contact protocol. You used a man with a scar and a courtesy warning because the people you were working with needed you to keep your source warm and compliant, and the way to do that was to give you the occasional gesture of consideration toward someone you understood mattered. Rourke absorbed this without visible reaction. They were managing you, she said, the same way you were managing the operation against us, patiently, from inside the thing you trusted. A silence that had a different texture than the ones before it. Then Rourke picked up the pen that Cassian had placed beside the document without Vivian noticing him do it, and he signed his name on the second signature line with the unhurried penmanship of a man who had made irrevocable decisions before and understood that the moment of signing was not the moment of the decision. The decision had been made somewhere earlier and quieter, and the pen was just the acknowledgement of it. He set the pen down. He picked up his glass. He said, without looking at either of them, "I want to go to Portland. My sister's there. I want to be done with cities." "That can be arranged," Cassian said. Rourke nodded once. He walked away from the bar toward the elevators without looking back, and Vivian watched him go, compact, gray-haired, unremarkable, moving through 200 oblivious people with the careful composure of a man who has just signed the final paper on a life he had been running for 12 years and was already constructing the silence that would follow it. She watched him until the elevator doors closed. Then she breathed out, slowly, from somewhere deep in her chest that had been held at reduced capacity for the past 4 hours. She felt the breath go all the way out and felt the moment it turned and came back in, and felt the particular quality of oxygen reaching parts of her that had been running on something smaller than air for most of the evening. Her elbow hurt, properly, now that the adrenaline was finishing its work, a deep, radiating complaint from the joint outward, not structural damage, but significant bruising, the kind that would make its presence known for the next week with reliable thoroughness. Cassian turned to her. He looked at her with an expression that was not managed. She had seen most of the managed versions of his face by now, and she knew the difference, and this was not one of them. This was something without a layer over it. "Your elbow," he said. "I know. There's a physician on call at the estate. I know that too." He reached out and very carefully, with a precision that was not clinical, but deliberate in the way of something being done with full awareness of its significance, he took her injured arm by the wrist and lifted it slightly to relieve the angle of the joint. She let him. It helped. She did not comment on either of those things. They stood at the bar of the Harlan Building's 14th floor ballroom while 200 people moved around them, and the ensemble played something unhurried at the far end of the room, and outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city ran its lights along its nighttime geometry below them. "I was still going to leave," she said. "I need you to know that. Tonight wasn't... I didn't stay because of Rourke. I stayed because you asked me to, and I decided to give you the hour." "I know," he said. "And what happened after? The estate, and the decision about the building, and the drive over. That wasn't me deciding to stay either. That was a situation requiring management, and I managed it." "Yes." "I'm telling you this because I need us to start from what is actually true, not from what tonight looked like. Tonight looked like a reconciliation. It wasn't. It was a crisis, and we were in it together, and we functioned, and that is a different thing." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a plane moved across the sky, its lights blinking in their patient sequence. "What would a reconciliation look like?" he said. Not with hope, not with the soft inflection of someone angling toward a preferred answer, with the same directness he brought to every question that actually mattered to him. She thought about it, genuinely, without performing the thinking. "Slower than tonight," she said. "Longer, Not a single conversation, and not a crisis, and not a situation where I have nowhere to go because the alternative involves my father being held in a suite by your ex-lieutenant. It would look like ordinary mornings, difficult ones, ones where you don't know what to say and say it anyway instead of maintaining the distance because the distance is easier. She looked at him. It would look like you being in a room with me because you chose to be there and not because the situation required it.
I can do that, he said.
You don't know that yet, she said. Neither do I. He accepted this without argument. She had not expected the acceptance, but she received it, and it sat differently than agreement would have, less smooth, more honest, like something unfinished that had been allowed to remain unfinished rather than being sanded down into a more comfortable shape. She said, I need to call Dana. Yes. And I need you to tell me where my father was taken and that he is sitting down somewhere with a cup of coffee and a very simple explanation of what tonight was. Torres has him. He's at a secondary location 8 minutes from here. The explanation he has been given is accurate but minimal. Good. She lowered her arm carefully. The joint complained, steadied. And Owen Mercer. Cassian looked at her. The baker. You built him a job in Seattle to remove him from my vicinity. You financed it with something that originated in guilt, whether or not you would call it that. I need you to make it real. Not as a transaction, not as another managed removal. I need you to personally contact him, tell him what you actually did and why, and let him decide whether the job is something he wants to keep on its own terms. Not on yours. A pause. Long enough to be honest about its difficulty. That is a conversation I am not equipped to have. I know, she said. Have it anyway. He nodded, one nod, the kind that wasn't agreement with the ease of something, but agreement with the necessity of it. She picked up her coat from the bar stool where she had set it. She looked around the ballroom one more time. The candlelight, the glassware, the 200 people who had spent the last 2 hours in the same room as the unraveling and reconstruction of something significant and had no idea. There was a specific solitude in that, she thought. Not a bad one. Just the ordinary solitude of consequence happening at the scale of individual lives inside the ambient noise of the world, continuing to function. They left the way they had come in. Through the lobby, with its calibrated geometry of visibility, out into the cold night air that smelled of rain already dried on pavement, into the car with Torres at the wheel and the city opening up ahead of them through the rain-wet windshield. In the car, she called Dana. The phone rang twice. I'm okay, Vivienne said, before Dana could speak. Are you okay? I'm in a car with a man named Torres who has explained almost nothing and driven me to what I believe is a very expensive safe house where there is excellent coffee. A pause. Are you actually okay? I have a bruised elbow and approximately 47 things I need to process, and none of them are emergencies. She looked out the window. I'll come to you tomorrow. I'll explain everything that I can explain. You don't have to explain anything. I know. I want to. She paused. The guest room. Is it still available? A beat of silence, then Dana said carefully, Is that what you want? Vivienne looked at the back of Torres's head. She looked at the city moving past the windows. She looked at the man beside her, Cassian, who was looking at the floor of the car with the particular focus of someone who was not listening, but also absolutely was listening, who had spent 2 years being precisely, carefully, deliberately absent from her life, and who had said please in a marble hallway and meant it with every dismantled layer of his architecture. I don't know yet, she said. Keep it available for now. Always, Dana said. She ended the call. The car was quiet. The city ran its lights across the tinted glass. Her elbow gave its sustained, radiating report. She was tired in the way that goes below muscle into something structural, the tiredness of a night that had required her to be, in rapid succession, a woman leaving her marriage, a woman understanding the depth of its complications, a decoy, a tactician, a daughter, and whatever she was in the conversation at the bar with Rourke. And all of those things had been her, genuinely, without performance, and the accumulated weight of them was considerable. She thought about this gray room with its unread books, and the amber emergency light, and the sound of Cassian's voice doing the excavation it had needed 2 years to begin. She thought about a Tuesday morning at an open-air market and a young man with flour on his cuffs who had treated her like a normal person having a normal morning. And she thought about the fact that the warmth of that 8 minutes had been real regardless of how Rourke had tried to use it, and she decided to keep it that way, to refuse the contamination, to insist on the clean version of the memory in which she had been a woman who laughed genuinely in the cold air, and that had been enough. The estate came into view through the windshield. Its lights were on, all of them, the exterior and interior both, which was not how it usually looked, and which meant the security sweep was still in progress, and which meant that for tonight the house would be populated with people doing the quiet, necessary work of aftermath. She had lived inside these walls for 2 years. She was not certain what she was walking back into. What she was certain of, with the flat, pragmatic certainty she had come to trust over the kind of certainty that required more emotional energy than she currently had, was that the version of the arrangement she was walking back into was not the one she had walked into 2 years ago. The original terms were void. Rourke had voided them, and the night had voided them, and the conversation in the gray room had voided them, and the hand in the car had voided them, and probably the pleas in the marble hallway had voided them before any of the rest. What replaced them was not yet fully formed. She thought that might be the only honest version of a beginning, one that didn't have its terms already written by someone else. Torres stopped the car. Cassian got out first, came around to her side, and opened the door. She stepped out into the night air and stood on the driveway of the estate that had been a gilded prison and a complicated home in the sight of the strangest night of her adult life, and looked up at the lit windows and breathed. He stood beside her, not touching, not maintaining the old engineered distance either, just beside her, at the natural proximity of two people who have been through something and are standing in its aftermath. She said, "You should know that I called the architectural firm 2 weeks ago. I've been in conversations about returning part-time. That is not contingent on anything that happens between us. I'm telling you so it's not a surprise." "It's not a surprise," he said. "I knew about the conversations." She looked at him. "I didn't interfere," he said. "I wanted you to know that." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the house. "There's going to have to be a different version of this," she said. "Whatever this is. Yes. I'm not ready to define it tonight. I know. And I may still go to Dana's." "I know that too." She nodded. She started toward the front door and he walked beside her and they went inside together into the lit house with its aftermath of organized security movement and its smell of the evening's cold carried in on both their coats. And she went upstairs to the suite that had been hers alone for 2 years and sat on the edge of the bed and held her elbow and looked at the ceiling for a long time. She was still in the house. She did not know precisely why. She suspected it was not because the night had resolved anything cleanly, because it hadn't, and she was not a woman who confused the resolution of a crisis with the resolution of the things that had made the crisis possible. She suspected it was something smaller and less legible than a decision, more like the simple fact that she was very tired, and the bed was here, and tomorrow was available for the harder choices, and tonight had taken enough. She heard footsteps in the corridor. They stopped outside her door. A knock. 3 knocks. Not loud. She said, "Come in." Cassian opened the door and stood in the doorway with the amber light of the corridor behind him. He held a bag of ice wrapped in a cloth that was obviously from the kitchen, Mrs. Caldwell's monogrammed linens repurposed with a pragmatism that, in a small way, made her want to laugh. He said, "For your elbow." She looked at the ice. She looked at him. She said, "You can come in." He came in. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, not close, not far, the natural distance of 2 people sitting on the same surface, and held out the ice. She took it and settled it against the joint and let the cold work and felt the immediate negotiation of relief. They sat in the quiet of the room that had been hers alone. Outside, the city ran its lights. Somewhere below, the house was settling back into its rhythms. The garden would be dark and bare with November nearly arrived. The paths her feet had learned without trying visible in the moonlight through the terrace doors. "I made pasta once," Cassian said. She looked at him. "6 months ago, Wednesday evening, you were at the gallery with Dana and I had a clear hour and I thought—" He stopped. Something in his face was doing a thing she had never seen it do, which was simply being uncertain about itself. "I made a complete disaster of it. Mrs. Caldwell found me at 10 o'clock and said nothing, but the expression on her face has not entirely left the house. Vivian looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Was it actually bad?" "It was catastrophic. The pasta dissolved. I don't know how pasta dissolves, but this pasta dissolved." She laughed. Not the large, surprised laugh of the market, something quieter and more complicated. The kind of laugh that has tiredness and relief and the particular texture of something genuinely unexpected in it. The kind of laugh that meant she had, in this moment, stopped managing herself. He looked at her when she laughed, and his face did something she had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, 2 years to see. He smiled. Not the professional arrangement of features that occasionally appeared at galas. Not the controlled acknowledgement of something marginally amusing. A real smile, brief and unguarded, arriving and leaving with the speed of something that hadn't yet learned to stay. It was enough. She settled the ice more firmly against her elbow and looked at the terrace door and the dark garden beyond it and thought about what she had told Dana. "I don't know yet. Keep it available." She thought that was still the truest answer. But she was sitting in this room, on this bed, with this man beside her in the careful quiet of the night, and the ice was working on the joint that had earned its damage defending itself, and tomorrow was available, and whatever the next version of this was, slower, more honestly built, more costly, and more real than the arrangement they had been handed on a wedding night 2 years ago. It had a tonight to begin from. That was not nothing. Outside, the last of the city's highlights moved across the ceiling in a slow arc. A plane, or a car on the elevated road, something passing. And both of them watched it go, and neither spoke. And the room held them in the ordinary silence of a house that was, for the first time since she had arrived, quiet in a way that felt chosen rather than imposed. She thought, this is not a resolution. She thought, it is something better than that. It is a beginning that knows what it cost to get here. And she held the ice against her elbow and she breathed, and the night settled around them, and the story they were inside of, the real one, not the one with the lawyer-written vows and the precise distances and the 7 words on a wedding night, began quietly and without ceremony in exactly the way that things which are going to last tend to begin, not with promises, with presence.